right, everyone, welcome back or welcome to the Water Ski Podcast. This is Matteo, and the goal of this podcast is to promote the sport of water skiing, as some of you returning listeners may know well. What I decided to do this week, which, by the way, apologies for last week absence of the Water Ski Podcast in your feeds. What I decided to do this week is to initiate a series of episodes that I've been wanting to do for a while, that I sort of dubbed under the name of Swerve Psychology. So basically bringing some of my expertise in sports psychology into the world of water skiing. So these are going to be, as of now, solo episodes, covering some sports psychology topic and see how that can be applicable to water skiing. The topic I decided to touch on today is athlete burnout, and I named the episode Skier Burnout because I'll try to give some applied recommendations that are applicable really to water skiers. But in order to do that, I need to give you guys a little bit of background on what burnout is. Now, we hear that word more and more often in general language, particularly in the workplace and in athletics. But there is a definition of burnout and a description of burnout that we should all be familiar with. Now, this is not to say that when someone more or less casually says they are burnt out, that doesn't indicate a problem behind, but that might not necessarily be true burnout. And we need to learn how to differentiate the two in order to somewhat treat it if it's present. And especially what I hope we'll be able to convey today is trying to prevent athlete burnout. So a little bit of background on what burnout is. Burnout is a prolonged syndrome that is definitely unpleasant, and it's related oftentimes to symptoms that are somewhat associated with depression, although burnout is definitely not depression. But there are some similarities. But essentially, one of the best definitions that was given of burnout is a state of fatigue or frustration brought about by devotion to a cause, way of life, or relationship that failed to produce the expected reward. Now, the early research in this particular state of fatigue or frustration really happened in the medical field, particularly with various healthcare professions, nursing, doctors. So a profession that really has long hours, and for all of you guys that are doing med school or rotations, you probably know what I'm talking about, and with a degree of negative occurrences that is certainly higher than what anyone would want. One can think of today's situations with COVID, right? Like hospitals are overfilled, healthcare professionals are trying to help, are doing more hours than they probably thought they could handle. And oftentimes there's just the sheer reality of not being able to help everyone that you want to help and that you try to help. So it is a state of fatigue and frustration that is really present in a lot of professions. And truly, to understand burnout, you need to look at the specific population that you're deciding to look at. So, for instance, the healthcare profession has a different type of burnout compared to, say, construction workers or people in finance or athletes, coaches. But what it appears is that when it comes to a profession, the three basically characteristic symptoms of burnout are a depersonalization, So basically starting to feel detached from the craft. Emotional exhaustion, and I think that was fairly clear when we touched on the healthcare profession, and a reduced or an inadequate sense of accomplishment. And here the verbiage is important because it's a sense of accomplishment. And as we will see, that will come back a lot when we talk about athlete burnout. And the other key concept about burnout is that for us to be able to talk about burnout, these three aspects, so again, depersonalization, emotional exhaustion, and an inadequate sense of accomplishment, need to coexist all three at a fairly high level. Meaning that if one of the three is not there, then it becomes difficult to talk about burnout. And as we will see, the coexistence of all three is rare. It's not very widespread, particularly in the athlete population, but it's certainly a reason for concern, and probably the reason why I did this whole podcast. Now one can ask, or could ask, why are you doing an episode on burnout where a lot of people are not even skiing, right? You're not in season. Well, there are people down under that are skiing, obviously, so I hope they'll find this relatable in the immediate moment. But my hope is also that through this we can try to learn more about burnout so that we can prevent it, right? So in that sense, it doesn't really matter where you are on your skiing season as you listen to this. So back to athlete burnout, researchers in sports psychology around the 90s realized that the definition of burnout that came from Maslach work, so essentially looking at healthcare professionals, looking at depersonalization, emotional exhaustion, and that inadequate sense of accomplishment, wasn't precisely touching on what athletes were reporting burnout to be, essentially. And so the definition and the symptomatological description of burnout, of athlete burnout that arisen, was a syndrome characterized by sport devaluation, emotional and physical exhaustion, and a reduced sense of accomplishment, right? Now, here it's interesting to see the differences. So obviously the first one that jumps to the eye is the fact that there was a physical exhaustion component added. And that makes a good deal of sense, considering that athletics almost always, I would say, involve a physical component that can be, exhausting, can be draining. The strain that is involved with any athletic activity, and of course water skiing as well, can take a toll over time. Of course, that emotional exhaustion, a reduced sense of accomplishment, now here reduced as opposed to inadequate, because sport by its nature allows different degrees of performance. And then of course sport devaluation. So here it becomes more of a not necessarily a detachment from the sport, more so a lacking of seeing the role of the sport in one's experience, right? So starting to pay little value to the sport. Now, one of the things I want to be clear is that burnout doesn't necessarily lend or result in dropout from the sport, or to a symptomatology that is akin to depression. That doesn't have to be the case, but it can. So obviously that's even more a motivation to try and reduce burnout in our skiers. Now, what brings about athlete burnout? There are various theories, but I'm going to cover two today because I think they lend themselves to good recommendations and good things that the skiers listening, the coaches listening can really apply in their day-to-day. So the first theory of burnout or model of burnout is a stress model. And so the idea here is that athlete burnout comes as a consequence of prolonged stress. So the best way to understand it is as you all know, sports and skiing as well have a lot of demands that are integral part to the sport, right? So think of a competitive water skier. There's things like traveling, cost, training, weather conditions. All these things are part of the demands of being a competitive water skier. Now, the second aspect to realize is that how one interprets these demands can elicit some stress. So things like feeling overwhelmed or even feeling threatened, say that fear response that might occur when you show up on the dock the first few times for a tournament, right? So according to how you interpret those demands that skiing brings, if they're interpreted negatively, they can elicit stress. Now, interpreting the demands in such a way can also lend to a physiological response and an emotional response, right? It could be a negative response, say like anger, frustration, and these emotions and these physiological changes, say heightened heart rate, more frequent respiratory response, these can result in some maladaptive coping behaviors, or say inappropriate behaviors, a decrease in performance, and possibly dropout. So the idea about this model is that you cycle through these, right? So you have demands, you might interpret them as threatening or overwhelming. Your emotional and physiological response is bad, which lends to maladaptive behaviors, which make more likely for you to interpret those things as overwhelming and frustrating. So the idea is, if this cycle continues, that's what brings about burnout. And there's solid research showing that this model is an appropriate way to understand how burnout comes about in athletes. Now, a second model that explains what might bring burnout about is what we call in sports psychology a commitment perspective. So this is more of a motivational understanding of burnout. And, the question, when you always talk about motivation, one of the questions that might arise is, why do people partake in sports? Or why do skiers water ski? And in the early 90s, Schmidt and Stein really identified 2 or 3 big motivations of why people partake in sports. So it could be enjoyment, it could be reasons beyond enjoyment, so for whatever other reason, and what happens more often than not, it's a combination of enjoyment and these other reasons. Now, if the interplay between these reasons, right, is seen as something that is forced on the athlete, then the athlete will most likely feel entrapped in the sport, almost like they can't get out of it, right? And in more modern terminology, this is what we sometimes refer to as a constrained commitment. So doing the sport or skiing because they have to, rather than because they want to. Now, if the interplay between enjoyment and those other factors, those other motivators, is more in the favor of enjoyment, then athletes will feel attracted to the sport as opposed to entrapped within the sport. And this is really what we now call enthusiastic commitment, or doing the sport because you want to rather than because you have to. Now, for the vast majority of skiers listening to this, you might think, well, sometimes I feel more like I want to ski and sometimes I feel more like I have to ski. And that's completely normal, right? So there are obligations that come with being an athlete that are sometimes felt like it's something that you have to do, but then there's also things, and even just skiing, that you often perceive like you want to do it. Now, the two coexist, right? You have both types of commitment with you, but when the have to commitment, so the constrained commitment, is prevalent for a prolonged period of time, then you might feel entrapped and you are more likely to experience burnout. Now, this goes for youth skiers, for junior skiers, as well as it goes for, professional skiers. There are things that you feel like that there are constraints on you, and some things that you are attracted to the sport and make you want to do the sport. Now, the question becomes, what can we do about this, right? And I hope that through the two perspectives, I'll be able to give you guys some sensical and applied recommendations. Now, one of the things that I want to preface before we get into these recommendations is that, sadly, research looking at treatment of burnout, so now we have an athlete who we have assessed as burnout. What do we do with this athlete? Sadly, there's not enough research about this. And one of the big reasons is that not a lot of athletes burn out. Research saying the NCAA sports show that the rates of burnout are in between 1 to 10% of the NCAA student athlete population. So it's still a sizable sample, but it's not as sizable to lend to, randomized control trials and really the type of research that will land into some solid applied recommendations. What we do know a little bit better, which in my opinion is a positive, is what can we do to prevent burnout, right? And now keep in mind that this, for us to be speaking about skier burnout or athlete burnout, we have to have all those three things at a fairly high level. So you have a skier who is emotionally and physically exhausted, a skier who has a reduced sense of accomplishment, and a skier who really devalues water skiing, right? All these three would have to coexist for us to be able to speak about burnout. And this doesn't happen super often. Two of the three often happen. So say someone who's overtrained, right? Skis a little bit more than what they should. There's a chance in which they might be physically drained, and because of that, not ski up to their potential, which might lend them to feel, frustrated, angry, and other emotional experiences that are certainly not pleasant. But if they still value skiing, if they're still wanting to get involved and their mind is still into skiing, well, then we can't really speak of burnout. Certainly, for as unpleasant as that skier might feel at the moment, we can't really speak of burnout. Now, because we can't really talk about treatment, and generally the recommendation for someone who is in burnout is really to take time off. That goes for sports, for profession, for job environments. Here's some of the things that we can do to prevent burnout. Now, this advice goes more out to skiers who are listening, is to really think about the stress perspective, right? So you have demands that lead into potential appraisal of those demands as threatening or overwhelming, which then leads to potential physiological and negative emotions, negative physiological and emotional states, which then led to maladaptive and inadequate behaviors. So one of the things that can really help with this is good old periodization, right? So it's something that unfortunately we don't see, in my opinion, enough in water skiing. Really periodizing your training, and especially periodizing your rest days. So the days in which you know, according to your plan, that you're not going to ski, right? Now, I know that there are all sorts of challenges. There are places where seasons are short. There are places where there's a lot of wind. So you sort of play it according to what the wind does on your lake. But whenever is feasible, the best would be to try to plan your training and plan your rest days, your days off, so that you basically are already working ahead towards avoiding too much strain, which then can lead to, poorer performances. The second recommendation that I would give to skiers who are, wanting to actively prevent burnout is to learn and practice some stress management techniques. Now, luckily, in the last few years, we are all more aware of some of the things that we can do to reduce our stress. So appropriate sleeping patterns, certain types of breathing exercises, maybe starting a meditation practice, also using other mental skills like imagery, and to a certain degree, goal setting, which really fits well with the periodization and planning that we spoke before, using these stress management techniques to where even if we are sometimes overwhelmed by the demands of water skiing, at least we have a go-to that will not spike our physiology and spike our negative emotions to the point that we would have maladaptive coping behaviors. And then, to me, as I researched burnout and happened to be working with athletes in professional settings, to me, the key component of burnout in athletes is that sport devaluation component, right? So you might be performing less than what you expect, and that's the real idea of reduced sense of accomplishment. Not necessarily how you place on rankings or at competitions, but are you performing up to your expectations? That's the sense of accomplishment that burnout is characterized by. So you could have that, but you still care about the sport. You still value it as an integral part of your life. You still see yourself as a skier. Then really burnout can stay at bay. It's when that aspect of skiing, your involvement, your passion, you're seeing yourself as a skier sort of wanders, and you have those other two components, that's when you are at risk of burnout. So one simple exercise that one can do, every now and then, it doesn't have to be obsessive or extremely frequent, but every now and then, sort of like trying to get in touch again with what the sport is to you, what role water skiing has in your life, in your future plans. Maybe you are a high school kid who's trying to get to college, so skiing has a big role. Really getting back in touch with why you're doing the sport and what the sport is to you. So these are some recommendations for skiers, really based on the stress explanation of burnout that hopefully can help prevent this syndrome. Now, what follows are a few recommendations for, let's say, more coaches, parents, people that are involved in helping skiers succeed. So here, remember, from a commitment perspective, you have that balance of like attraction and entrapment, or wanting to do the sport and not necessarily versus, and having to do the sport, feeling that you're sort of constrained in that role. So, of course, the recommendation here is to help playing around with that balance. And I think for parents specifically, but also for coaches of young skiers, it's really important to balance the enjoyment with things that need to happen for the skier to improve, right? So say you have a young junior overall skier under you, you probably know that those 3 to 5 loosely sets per day will have to happen to cover all the events. But at the same time, there can also be some time for fun within those training sessions, right? So a silly example would be it's 2 weeks before a tournament, you have to train that trick run, but nothing impedes you from making your skier try a new trick, something fun that they enjoy doing. Now, the other thing is that it doesn't necessarily have to be within the set. It could be also outside, making sure that the skier wants to be in that environment to the point that they feel more attracted to coming back to the lake, to doing that second slalom set, etc., as opposed to feeling it more as an obligation. The other recommendation, and I think here, self-determination theory has been widespread enough to understand this verbiage, but basically to increase that intrinsic motivation in skiers, meaning skiing itself reinforces the behavior of showing up to the lake and wanting to ski. Now, how can you do this? You can play and leverage on the three basic needs that are more likely to bring intrinsic motivation. So autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Now, autonomy, and this is tough sometimes for coaches and parents to give autonomy to their kids in terms of skiing, but one of the things that you can have them decide is, you have slalom, trick, and jump, say the overall skier, how many of each do you want to do today? Or if that's perceived as too much autonomy, when do you want to slalom today, as opposed to when do you want to trick? So giving a little bit of control to the young skier will make it more likely for them to wanting to come back to the lake and wanting to ski more. Now, the other aspect is competence. And competence really comes from knowledge. And I think in general, in water skiing, we're very good at that. There's always a willingness to understand more how your equipment works, how certain technical movements work, even at a young age. So fostering that aspect certainly can help the skier wanting to ski more, as opposed to feeling that they have to do that extra set. And then finally, in terms of relatedness, any opportunity for, socialization within the lake, of course, making sure that whenever possible, your young skiers can be skiing with other young skiers, and seeking those opportunities has a huge impact on making sure that your skier wants to ski, as opposed to feeling that they have to ski, right? So I know I kept this advice for coaches and parents more about younger skiers, but that's honestly the population that is also fairly more subjected to burnout. Not to say that high-level athletes are not, but this is where we have the potential of experiencing burnout to the point that we will lose some skiers. So I felt in this aspect I wanted to keep it more related to young water skiers. But my final advice really is to, in a sense, be reassured that burnout is not as frequent as the amount of times we talk about it, which is a good thing. And again, this is not to downplay the emotions and the challenges that one may experience when they say, I'm burnt out. That might not be burnout necessarily. However, when the burnout does happen, it's a very unpleasant experience. It generally would have to result in taking some time off the sport, not necessarily dropping off out of the sport, but taking a bit of distance to lower down the symptoms of reduced sense of accomplishment, emotional and physical exhaustion, and sport devaluation. And so my hope is that even just a little bit more knowledge about what athlete burnout really is can help you proactively prevent it, so that you don't get in a situation where you obviously feel unpleasant and have to take a little bit of time away from the sport just to regain motivation, to regain physical strain, and to regain emotional fortitude. So I hope you found this helpful. I know it's a little bit of a different episode from usual. And really, to tell you the truth, that's why I took that break last week. I just wanted to really make sure this is something I want to start. I encourage you to let me know what you thought about this episode via email, Matteo at thewaterskipodcast.com, or on Instagram, however you want to communicate with me. Just let me know what you thought about this, because if you found it helpful, then I'll I'll try my hardest to continue and provide this type of content. Until then, I hope you enjoy a good week, and I'll catch you next week with an interview. Thank you.